What you're about to hear will make you question every isolated farmhouse you've ever driven past. These aren't just stories. These are real events that happen to real people in places where screaming for help means nothing because no one can hear you. Tonight, I'm taking you to 6 remote farm homes where the isolation that promised peace became a nightmare that some never escaped. And I guarantee you, after hearing what happened in that last farmhouse, you'll never look at rural properties the same way again. So, turn off your lights, lock your doors, and whatever you do, don't watch this alone. Because what happened to these families could happen to anyone living where the nearest neighbor is miles away and help is even further. In March 2019, the Peterson family bought their dream home, a 200-acre farm in rural Montana, miles from civilization. Sarah Peterson thought it was perfect. No traffic, no noise, no neighbors peering over fences, just them, their 2 young children, and endless open space. But isolation cuts both ways. The first sign something was wrong came 3 weeks after they moved in. Sarah woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps on their gravel driveway. She shook her husband Mike awake, and they both crept to the window. In the moonlight, they could see a figure standing perfectly still at the edge of their property, just staring at the house. Mike grabbed his flashlight and went outside, but by the time he reached the spot, whoever it was had vanished. They convinced themselves it was probably just a lost hiker, or maybe someone whose car had broken down. They were wrong. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same spot. But this time, the figure was closer. Much closer. Close enough that Sarah could make out that it was a man wearing dark clothes and what looked like a wide-brimmed hat. When Mike went outside again, he found fresh boot prints in the mud leading right up to their front porch. That's when they called the sheriff. But living 40 miles from the nearest town meant it took him over an hour to arrive. By then, of course, there was no one to find. The deputy took a report and promised to increase patrols in the area, but they both knew how empty that promise was in a county with 3 officers covering hundreds of square miles. On the 4th night, Sarah decided to stay awake and keep watch. At exactly 2 a.m., she saw him again. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were 3 figures now, standing in a perfect line across their driveway. None of them moved. They just stood there for exactly 1 hour, then walked away into the darkness. Mike wanted to confront them, but Sarah begged him not to. Something about the way they stood so perfectly still, so organized, terrified her more than anything she'd ever experienced. The visits continued every single night for 2 weeks. Always the same time. Always the same duration. The number of figures kept growing. By the end of the 2nd week, there were 7 of them forming a semicircle around the house. Then, on a Friday night in April, they made their move. Sarah was awakened not by footsteps on gravel, but by the sound of her front door opening. She grabbed Mike's arm, and they both listened in absolute terror as slow, deliberate footsteps moved through their living room below. Mike reached for his shotgun, but before he could grab it, they heard their 8-year-old daughter Emma scream from her bedroom down the hall. Not a scared scream, a scream of pure terror that no parent should ever have to hear. Mike ran toward Emma's room, but the hallway lights suddenly went out, plunging everything into complete darkness. Sarah heard Mike crash into something, then heard him yelling Emma's name. She fumbled for her phone to call 911, but there was no signal. Their landline was dead too. In the darkness, Sarah could hear multiple sets of footsteps moving through their house. Heavy boots on hardwood floors. The sound of doors opening and closing. And somewhere in that chaos, Emma's voice calling for help. Sarah made it to Emma's room first. The window was wide open and Emma was gone. The bed sheets were still warm. Mike found their 5-year-old son Tommy hiding under his bed, too terrified to speak. By the time they got him calmed down enough to talk, he whispered something that made Sarah's blood freeze. "The man in the hat told me to be quiet while they took Emma to meet the others." They drove straight to the sheriff's office that night, refusing to stay in the house another second. A massive search was launched at dawn. Dogs, helicopters, volunteers from 3 counties. They searched for 6 days straight. Emma Peterson was never found. The boot prints around the house matched 7 different pairs of boots. The FBI got involved, but the trail went cold, faster than morning frost. No witnesses, no DNA evidence, no ransom demands. Just a little girl who vanished into the Montana wilderness like she never existed. The Peterson family moved back to the city immediately. They never returned to the farm, not even to collect their belongings. The property was sold at auction 3 months later. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. The real estate records show that the farm had been sold and abandoned 4 times in the past 15 years. Each family had left suddenly in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind. And according to local records, 3 other children had gone missing from properties within a 10-mile radius over the past 2 decades. All of them taken from isolated farm homes. All of them never found. The locals call that stretch of Montana the taking ground. And Emma Peterson's case is still open, because somewhere out there in that wilderness, those 7 figures are still waiting for the next family to move in. In 1987, retired couple Robert and Margaret Henley bought a 150-acre homestead in rural Arkansas. They were looking for peace and quiet after decades of city life. What they found instead was something that would haunt investigators for over 30 years. The Henleys lived alone on their property for 3 years without incident. They grew their own food, raised chickens, and enjoyed the solitude that only complete isolation can provide. Their nearest neighbor was over 8 miles away, down a dirt road that was barely passable in bad weather. That isolation would become their death sentence. On October 13th, 1990, their neighbor, Earl Mackenzie, drove by the Henley property and noticed something strange. The chickens were running loose in the yard, and the front door was standing wide open. Earl knew the Henleys were careful people who never left their door open, especially not with chickens to worry about. He walked up to the house and called out, but got no response. The silence was unnatural. Even the chickens seemed nervous, clustering together near the barn instead of spreading out like they normally did. Earl stepped through the open front door and immediately knew something terrible had happened. The living room was in complete chaos. Furniture was overturned, family photos were smashed on the floor, and there were dark stains on the carpet that looked suspiciously like blood. But it was what he found in the kitchen that made him run back to his truck and speed to the nearest phone. Margaret Henley was tied to a chair at the kitchen table. Her mouth was taped shut, and her eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead. She was alive, but barely. When Earl removed the tape from her mouth, she couldn't speak. She could only make soft whimpering sounds like a wounded animal. Robert was nowhere to be found. The police arrived 2 hours later, along with an ambulance. Margaret was rushed to the hospital, but she never recovered enough to tell them what happened. The trauma had damaged her mind so severely that she couldn't form coherent sentences. She died 6 months later in a care facility, taking the secret of that night to her grave. The investigation revealed details that made seasoned detectives sick to their stomachs. Based on the evidence, Robert and Margaret had been held captive in their own home for at least 3 days. The attackers had tortured them slowly, methodically, like they were enjoying every second of it. Robert's body was found 2 weeks later by a search team. He'd been dragged into the woods behind the house and left in a shallow grave. The coroner determined he'd been beaten to death with farming tools from the Henleys' own barn. But here's what made this case truly disturbing. They had simply come to torture and kill, then left as quietly as they'd arrived. The crime scene analysis showed that at least 4 different people had been in the house during the attack. They'd eaten the Henleys' food, used their bathroom, even watched their television while Robert and Margaret suffered. They'd made themselves completely at home while committing the most brutal acts imaginable. Footprints around the property suggested the attackers had been watching the house for days before making their move. They'd learned the Henleys' routine, figured out when they were most vulnerable, then struck with military precision. The case generated dozens of suspects, but no arrests. The Henley homestead sat empty for 5 years before being demolished. The new owners, a young family from Little Rock, lasted exactly 3 months before moving away in the middle of the night. They never explained why they left, but neighbors reported seeing lights in the abandoned barn at all hours, lights that moved like people carrying flashlights. And sometimes, late at night, they could hear what sounded like screaming coming from the woods where Robert Henley's body was found. In 2003, another family tried to build a new house on the property. Construction workers reported tools going missing, equipment being sabotaged, and the constant feeling that they were being watched from the tree line. The project was abandoned after a bulldozer operator claimed he saw 4 figures standing in the exact spot where the old farmhouse had been. The Henley property remains empty to this day. Local real estate agents won't even list it anymore. They say some places are too stained with evil to ever be homes again. And sometimes, on quiet October nights when the wind is just right, people driving past that empty land report hearing the sound of chickens frantically clucking in a yard that hasn't existed for decades. Daniel Morrison thought he was giving his wife and 3 children the perfect life when he bought a remote dairy farm in northern Wisconsin in 2014. The 300-acre property came with a beautiful old farmhouse, a working barn, and enough land to raise cattle and grow crops. It seemed like the American dream made real. The dream became a nightmare within 6 months. It started with small things. Tools moving from where Daniel had left them, gates being left open that he was sure he'd closed, milk going sour days before it should have. Daniel assumed it was just the stress of adjusting to farm life. His wife Lisa wasn't so sure. She kept hearing sounds at night that didn't belong. Footsteps in the barn when all the animals were quiet. The creak of the porch swing moving when there was no wind. Voices whispering just outside the range of understanding. Their children started having nightmares. 8-year-old Michael claimed there was a man watching him through his bedroom window. 6-year-old Sarah refused to go to the barn alone, saying the shadow people lived in the hayloft. Baby Jessica would cry inconsolably whenever they took her outside after sunset. Daniel dismissed it all as imagination until the night he saw them himself. He was doing a late check on the cattle when he noticed someone standing in the middle of his pasture. The figure was perfectly still, like a scarecrow, but there was no scarecrow in that field. Daniel called out, but the figure didn't respond. As he got closer, the figure simply turned and walked toward the woods at the edge of the property, moving with an odd, jerky gait that didn't look human. That was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the Morrison family was subjected to what can only be described as psychological warfare. Their phone would ring at all hours, but no one would be on the other end. Just heavy breathing and occasionally a low voice saying things like, "We're watching and soon." Someone was poisoning their cattle. 2 cows died within a week, both showing signs of having ingested antifreeze. Their vegetable garden was destroyed overnight. Every plant carefully uprooted and left to die in neat piles. Family photos started disappearing from inside the house. only to be found days later nailed to trees around the property. Daniel bought security cameras and motion lights, but they were sabotaged as fast as he could install them. Whoever was terrorizing them knew exactly what they were doing and had unlimited access to the property despite Daniel's efforts to secure it. The breaking point came on a cold November night. Lisa woke up to find baby Jessica's crib empty. She screamed for Daniel, and they searched the house frantically before hearing Jessica crying outside. They found her in the barn, lying in an empty horse stall, completely unharmed, but somehow dressed in clothes that weren't hers. The clothes were old-fashioned, like something from the 1950s, and smelled like they'd been stored in a basement for decades. There was a note pinned to Jessica's blanket that read, "She's perfect. We'll be back for her soon." That same night, while Daniel and Lisa were comforting Jessica, someone entered their house and rearranged all the furniture in the living room. Every piece had been moved to face the windows, like an audience waiting for a show. On the kitchen table, they found old photographs of their family that had been taken without their knowledge over the past several months. The photos showed them going about their daily routines, but in each one, there were shadowy figures visible in the background. Figures they'd never noticed while living their lives, but who had clearly been watching them constantly. Daniel called the sheriff, but there was little law enforcement could do. No actual crimes had been committed except for the cattle poisoning, and there were no witnesses or evidence pointing to specific perpetrators. The deputy suggested they might want to consider moving, especially with young children involved. But before the Morrisons could make that decision, their tormentors made it for them. On December 15th, 2014, Daniel woke up to find his entire herd of cattle dead in the pasture. 23 head of cattle, all lying in a perfect circle, all killed by single gunshots to the head. The precision was terrifying, professional, like an execution. In the center of the circle of dead cattle, someone had used gasoline to burn a message into the frozen ground. Leave now, or join them. The Morrison family packed their car that morning and drove away from the farm forever. They didn't even stop to collect their belongings. Daniel later hired a moving company to retrieve their things, but when the movers arrived, they found the house completely empty. Every piece of furniture, every personal item, every family photo had vanished. The insurance company called it theft, but the police investigation turned up something even more disturbing. According to county records, the Morrison farm had been the site of multiple unexplained deaths dating back to the 1940s. 3 different families had met violent ends on that property, and each time, the survivors had reported being stalked and terrorized for months before the final attacks. The farm was sold at auction for a fraction of its value. The new owners, a real estate development company, planned to subdivide the land for residential use. But construction crews refused to work the site after equipment operators reported seeing groups of people watching them from the woods. People who disappeared the moment anyone tried to approach them. Today, the Morrison farm sits empty once again. The house is slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness, and the barn is home only to bats and spiders. But sometimes, on clear winter nights, drivers on the nearby highway report seeing lights moving around the abandoned buildings. Lights that move in patterns, like people carrying lanterns, walking in careful circles, still waiting for the next family brave enough to call that cursed land home. In 2008, the Blackwood family thought they'd found paradise when they purchased a sprawling 500-acre ranch in remote New Mexico. James and Patricia Blackwood, along with their teenage twins, Mark and Emma, were tired of city life and ready for a fresh start raising horses in the desert. The ranch came with a tragic history that the previous owner had conveniently forgotten to mention. The first few months were everything they dreamed of. The twins adapted to their new school, Patricia started a small horse boarding business, and James finally had the space to pursue his passion for woodworking. Life was good until Patricia started noticing that her horses were acting strange. These weren't nervous animals. They were well-trained quarter horses that had been around people their entire lives. But suddenly, they were refusing to go near certain parts of the property. They would rear and fight against their leads whenever Patricia tried to take them to the north pasture, and they would stand at the fence line staring into the desert for hours at a time. Animals know things that people don't. The Blackwoods should have listened to their horses. The first direct sign of trouble came when James found evidence that someone had been camping on their property. He discovered the remains of several small fires in a canyon about a mile from the house, along with empty food cans and human waste. Someone had been living rough on their land for weeks, maybe months. James called the county sheriff, but the deputy who responded seemed oddly reluctant to investigate. He took a quick look at the campsite and suggested that it was probably just migrant workers passing through on their way north. He advised the Blackwoods to post some no trespassing signs and maybe get a dog. They got 2 dogs, German shepherds, named Rex and Bella. The dogs lasted 3 weeks before disappearing without a trace. James found their collars hung from a fence post near the property line, but no sign of the animals themselves. That's when Patricia started pushing for them to leave. Something about the ranch felt wrong in a way she couldn't explain. The silence was too complete. The sky seemed too big, and there was always the sense that they were being watched by eyes they couldn't see. James refused to abandon their dream. They'd invested everything they had in the ranch, and he wasn't about to let some vagrant camping in the desert scare them away. He bought a rifle and started patrolling the property every evening, looking for signs of trespassers. He never found the trespassers, but they found him. On March 3rd, 2009, James didn't come back from his evening patrol. Patricia waited until midnight before driving out to look for him. She found his ATV parked at the edge of the north pasture, the engine still running, but James was nowhere to be seen. His rifle was lying on the ground beside the ATV, fully loaded and unfired. His footprints led about 20 yards into the desert before disappearing completely, as if he'd simply been lifted into the air. Patricia called 911, and this time, the response was swift and massive. Search and rescue teams arrived at dawn with dogs, horses, and helicopters. They combed every inch of the 500-acre ranch and the surrounding public land. The search continued for 5 days straight. James Blackwood was never found. But on the 3rd day of the search, one of the tracking dogs made a discovery that changed everything. In a remote canyon almost 3 miles from the house, they found what appeared to be a camp that had been hastily abandoned. Not just a camp, but a settlement that had obviously been occupied for years. There were multiple shelters built from salvaged materials, fire pits, food storage areas, and most disturbingly, what looked like a workshop filled with handmade weapons and traps. The sheriff's department found evidence that at least a dozen people had been living in that canyon, watching the ranch, and probably every family that had owned it before the Blackwoods. In one of the shelters, investigators found a collection of photographs that made everyone's skin crawl. Pictures of the Blackwood family going about their daily routines, taken with telephoto lenses from various hiding spots around the property. There were hundreds of photos dating back to the day they'd first moved in. The photos showed that the family had been under constant surveillance for almost a year. Someone had documented their every move, learning their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. The last photo in the collection showed James on his ATV, taken just moments before he vanished. Patricia and the twins left New Mexico that week and never returned. The ranch was sold to a holding company that intended to develop it into a luxury resort, but those plans fell through when construction workers started finding human remains buried around the property. Over the next 2 years, the remains of 7 people were recovered from various locations on the ranch. Some had been buried for decades. Others were more recent. None of them were ever identified, and none of them were James Blackwood. The FBI classified the case as a serial killing investigation, but without living suspects or witnesses, the trail went cold quickly. The theory was that a group of drifters had been using the remote canyon as a base for attacks on isolated families throughout the region, but they disappeared completely after James's abduction. Today, the Blackwood Ranch sits empty and abandoned. The house has been stripped by vandals, and the desert is slowly reclaiming the land. But local law enforcement still receives reports of lights moving through that canyon at night, and sometimes hikers find fresh campsites that are abandoned as soon as they're discovered. James Blackwood's case remains open, though most investigators doubt he'll ever be found alive. But Patricia still believes that somewhere out there in the New Mexico desert, in some hidden canyon or cave system, her husband is being held by people who have turned isolation into a weapon and turned the wilderness into their hunting ground. The ranch is for sale again, for the 6th time in 15 years. The asking price keeps dropping, but so far, no one has been willing to take the risk of making that cursed piece of desert their home. In 2017, military veteran Mike Sullivan thought his combat experience had prepared him for anything. After 3 tours in Afghanistan, he figured that running a small farm in rural Oregon would be the peaceful retirement he'd earned. He bought 80 acres of fertile land with his wife Karen and their 2 young sons, planning to raise organic vegetables and maybe some livestock. Mike's military training would be the only thing that kept his family alive. The trouble started almost immediately, but in ways so subtle that Mike almost missed the signs. Tools would be moved slightly from where he'd left them. Fence posts would be loosened. Gates would be found open in the morning that he was certain he'd closed the night before. To most people, these would seem like minor annoyances. But Mike's combat experience had taught him to recognize the signs of being probed by an enemy gathering intelligence. Someone was testing his awareness, his routines, his defenses. He started varying his schedule and paying closer attention to his surroundings. That's when he noticed the footprints. Fresh boot prints appeared regularly in the soft soil around his barn and near the house, but they were always placed carefully to avoid his security cameras. Whoever was making them knew exactly where his blind spots were and how to move without being detected. Mike installed additional cameras and motion sensors, but the visits continued. Worse, they were becoming bolder. He found evidence that someone had been inside his barn, going through his tools and equipment. Nothing was stolen, but everything had been examined and cataloged. Karen wanted to call the police, but Mike knew that rural law enforcement was stretched thin and wouldn't be able to provide the kind of protection his family might need. Instead, he began preparing for a siege. Using skills learned in the military, Mike turned his farmhouse into a fortress. He reinforced doors and windows, stockpiled food and water, and established defensive positions with clear fields of fire. He also set up a communications plan with his nearest neighbor, a retired sheriff's deputy named Tom Martinez who lived 2 miles away. Karen thought he was being paranoid until the night they tried to take their youngest son. Mike was checking the perimeter around midnight when he heard Karen scream from inside the house. He ran back to find her standing in their 4-year-old son Danny's bedroom, the window wide open and the child's bed empty. But Mike's preparations had paid off. He'd installed silent alarms on all the windows, and he knew exactly which one had been breached and when. He grabbed his rifle and night vision goggles and went hunting. He found them before they could get Danny off the property. 3 men carrying his son toward a pickup truck parked on the dirt road that bordered his land. Mike's military training kicked in, and he moved through the darkness like a ghost. The first man never knew what hit him. Mike took him down silently from behind, using techniques learned in Special Forces training. The second man turned toward the sound and found himself staring down the barrel of an assault rifle held by someone who'd killed professionally for his country. "Put my son down now, or I'll put you down permanently," Mike said in a voice that left no doubt he meant every word. The man holding Danny immediately set the boy on the ground and stepped back with his hands raised. The third man tried to run for the truck, but stopped when Mike put a warning shot through the vehicle's engine block. Mike secured all three men using zip ties and called the sheriff's department. While they waited for law enforcement to arrive, one of the attackers started talking, probably hoping for leniency. What he revealed chilled Mike to the bone. The three men were part of a larger group that had been targeting isolated farm families throughout Oregon and Washington for over 5 years. They would study families for months, learning their routines and vulnerabilities, then strike when the families were most defenseless. Sometimes they were after money or valuables, but often they were looking for children. Young children who could be taken and sold to buyers who preferred victims that no one would miss from remote areas where disappearances might not even be reported for days. The Sullivan family had been under surveillance for over 6 months. The group had detailed files on every member of the family, including photos, daily schedules, and assessments of how much resistance they might face during an abduction attempt. They'd chosen to take Danny because he was young enough to be manageable, but old enough to have value to their buyers. The plan had been to take him first, then come back for his older brother once the family was traumatized and disorganized. What they hadn't counted on was Mike's military background and his tactical preparations. Most farm families were soft targets who would panic and call the police while the attackers escaped with their victims. Mike had turned his property into a kill zone and himself into a one-man army. The three men were arrested and eventually provided information that led to the dismantling of a human trafficking ring operating throughout the Pacific Northwest. 17 children who had been reported missing over the past 3 years were recovered from various locations, though several others were never found. Mike and Karen decided to stay on their farm, but they made significant changes to their security arrangements. The property now looks more like a military compound than a family farm, with razor wire, guard towers, and enough surveillance equipment to monitor a small city. Mike still raises vegetables, but he also provides security consulting to other farm families who want to protect themselves from predators who see rural isolation as an opportunity rather than peaceful solitude. The Sullivan farm has never been targeted again, probably because word has spread through criminal networks that Mike Sullivan is not a victim waiting to happen. He's a predator hunter who's turned his home into a trap for anyone stupid enough to threaten his family. But late at night, when the wind is blowing through the Oregon hills, Mike sometimes still sees movement at the edge of his property. Shadows that don't belong, shapes that disappear when he focuses his night vision equipment on them. He knows they're still out there, looking for easier targets. Families who haven't learned that sometimes the only interstate. This last story happened just 3 years ago, and it's the reason why I'll never drive past an isolated farmhouse without wondering what horrors might be hidden behind those peaceful-looking windows. In 2021, the Carpenter family bought what they thought was their dream home. A restored 19th century farmhouse on 200 acres in rural Vermont, complete with original stone walls, hardwood floors, and enough land to be completely self-sufficient. David and Jennifer Carpenter, along with their 3 children, were ready to escape the chaos of modern life and live simply. They had no idea they were moving into a hunting ground that had been used for over a century. The first sign that something was wrong came from their 12-year-old daughter, Ashley. She claimed that someone was watching her from the woods while she played in the yard. When David investigated, he found what looked like a hunting blind built high in an oak tree, positioned to provide a clear view of the entire property. The blind was old, constructed from weathered wood, and camouflaged so well that it was almost invisible from the ground. But it had been recently used. David found fresh food wrappers, water bottles, and most disturbingly, a notebook filled with detailed observations about his family's daily routines. The entries went back 3 months, starting before the Carpenters had even moved in. Someone had been watching the house, waiting for new victims to arrive. David called the state police, and this time the response was immediate and thorough. A detective named Sarah Chen had been investigating a series of disappearances in rural Vermont and recognized the Carpenter case as fitting a disturbing pattern. Over the past 15 years, Chen explained, 7 families had vanished from isolated properties within a 50-mile radius. Not individual disappearances, but entire families who had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind houses full of belongings and no indication of where they'd gone or what had happened to them. The pattern was always the same. Families would report being watched and followed for weeks or months before disappearing. Local law enforcement would investigate, but with no crime scenes, no witnesses, and no evidence of foul play, the cases would eventually go cold. Detective Chen believed they were dealing with an organized group that had been operating in rural Vermont for decades, possibly generations. The hunting blind on the Carpenter property was just one of dozens she'd discovered over the years, all strategically positioned to observe isolated homes without being detected. What made this case different was that the Carpenters had discovered the surveillance before disappearing. For the first time, Chen had potential witnesses who might be able to help her identify and catch the people responsible for decades of terror. She arranged for the family to be relocated to a safe house, while a joint FBI State Police task force set up surveillance on the Carpenter farm. The plan was to use the property as bait, with undercover agents posing as the family while monitoring for any attempted approach. The plan worked better than anyone expected, but not in the way they'd hoped. On the 3rd night of surveillance, motion detectors around the property registered multiple contacts approaching the house from different directions. What the surveillance team observed through their night vision equipment was unlike anything they'd prepared for. 12 people, moving in perfect coordination, surrounded the house within minutes. They weren't armed with guns, but with tools that looked like they'd been designed specifically for capturing people alive. Nets, restraints, and what appeared to be homemade tranquilizer devices. These weren't random criminals or opportunistic predators. They moved like a military unit that had been conducting this type of operation for years. Every person knew their role, their timing, and their objective. The surveillance team called for backup and prepared to arrest the entire group, but what happened next turned the operation into a nightmare. As the 12 figures moved toward the house, thermal imaging detected at least 20 more people emerging from concealed positions throughout the woods surrounding the property. The Carpenter farm wasn't just being watched by a small group of criminals. It was surrounded by what appeared to be an entire community of people who had made hunting isolated families their way of life. The FBI team found themselves outnumbered 2 to 1 by people who knew the terrain and had obviously been preparing for this exact scenario. A firefight erupted that lasted over an hour, and when backup finally arrived, they found a scene that veteran law enforcement officers still refused to discuss publicly. 8 members of the attacking group were killed in the firefight. 4 others were captured alive, but died from their injuries before they could be questioned. The rest melted back into the Vermont wilderness like they'd never existed. But the most disturbing discovery came when investigators searched the bodies and the equipment left behind. These people had been living off the grid for what appeared to be generations. Their clothing was homemade, their tools were crafted by hand, and their weapons were primitive but effective. They found maps marking dozens of isolated properties throughout Vermont, New Hampshire, and upstate New York. Properties where families had disappeared over the past 50 years. properties that were now marked with symbols indicating whether they'd been harvested or were still available for hunting. The Carpenter property was marked as ready for harvest, with detailed notes about each family member's habits, weaknesses, and potential resistance. DNA analysis of the captured attackers revealed something that made the case even more disturbing. Several of them were related, suggesting that entire bloodlines had been living in the wilderness, surviving by preying on isolated families for multiple generations. The investigation uncovered evidence of dozens of crimes dating back to the 1970s, but most of the evidence had been destroyed or hidden so well that prosecutors could only bring charges for the crimes committed during the actual surveillance operation. The Carpenter family never returned to their Vermont farm. The property was seized by the state and turned into a training facility for law enforcement agencies learning to deal with off-grid criminal communities. But here's what keeps Detective Sarah Chen awake at night. The people killed and captured at the Carpenter farm represented only a fraction of the community that had been operating in those woods. Thermal imaging from the night of the raid suggested that over 60 people had been involved in watching the surveillance operation, but only 32 were ever accounted for. That means there are still dozens of people out there in the Vermont wilderness, people who have been raised from birth to see isolated families as prey to be hunted and harvested. The state police increased patrols in rural areas, but Vermont has thousands of square miles of forest where a community could hide indefinitely. And every few months, Chen gets reports of new hunting blinds being discovered. New evidence that the survivors are still out there, still watching, still waiting for the next family brave enough to seek peace and solitude in the remote corners of New England. The Carpenter case is officially closed, but Chen knows it's far from over. Somewhere in those endless green mountains, the hunt continues. These 6 stories share one terrifying truth. The isolation that draws people to remote farm properties is the same isolation that makes them perfect hunting grounds for predators who understand that screaming for help means nothing when help is miles away. Every one of these families thought they were escaping to safety. Instead, they discovered that some of the most dangerous predators in the world aren't found in cities or crowded places. They're found in the spaces between civilization, in the forgotten corners of the country where evil can operate without witnesses or interference. The next time you drive past a remote farmhouse, remember these stories. If these stories made your skin crawl, like the video. It tells the algorithm you survived. Subscribe and turn on the bell. We drop new nightmares regularly. Share with someone brave or someone who thinks they are. Comment below. We want to know what you would have done. Some stories don't end when the lights come on. This is Dread Dynasty. We'll see you in the next scare.